We now come to what the scholars in these ancient Near Eastern treaties would call the covenant stipulations. And as I mentioned earlier, it's the end of chapter 4 to the end of chapter 11 is what is known as the general principles, the general stipulations. And then in chapter 12, it goes on to the more detailed stipulations. And so this, in these ancient treaties, there's a strong connection to what has gone before, but it's laying out the purpose of those detailed stipulations. And it consists in these ancient treaties of mostly general imperatives, but the biggest call is loyalty. That is the thing the suzerain wants. He wants the vassal to be loyal, and that's what he's requiring. Now, we see so much similarity when we look at these chapters, because firstly, you'll notice in chapter 5, it begins with a restatement of the Ten Commandments. And what we will see is chapter 12 following is in many ways taking each of these commandments and unpacking them and to how they would work out in different situations within the nation. But I want you to notice how he begins. In chapter 5 verse 6, he says, "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt and out of the house of slavery." In other words, I am the one who brought you into a place of freedom. And the whole point of the Ten Commandments is that God wanted Israel to stay in that place of freedom. He wanted them to be able to live and enjoy a freedom from slavery of any kind. And so the very first commandment is, "You shall have no other gods before me." And this is a foundational one because their background, as we've mentioned, was idolatry. They would have been in slavery of fear and to the requirements of all of the different gods there in Egypt. And the different myths of the gods would speak about values that these different gods had. And when it comes to this commandment, which is the very first one, it's important because this actually reflects the world view that the people would have when they look at life. Because the God we worship influences us, and the God a society worships influences that society. Now, we can see this even in nations today. You go to back a few years, and there were nations that were very open and very committed to atheism. And you would go to these nations and you would see the consequence of that particular worldview. Or you go to a nation that is Hindu, and you look at that society and you see the consequences of that particular worldview. The same would be for a Muslim society. You look at the society and you can see how the God or gods they worship is worked out in the values, the priorities of that particular people. Whether there's a massive control, or whether there's a neglect of showing mercy to poor people, whether it's the control of women, or whatever it is, you see that worked out. And so here at the very beginning, what God is saying, you should have no other gods before me, because I am the one who should be setting your worldview, your understanding of the world, and my values, my priorities, my concerns need to be foundational to you and in your society. And so we begin there with, you have no other gods before me. And we need to understand that this isn't because God was nervous that if they worshipped other gods that he would be jealous or upset or something. In other words, what I'm saying, it wasn't for his benefit that this law was given, that he kind of needed something. No, this law was given for the sake of the people, because as they worshipped the one true living God, so they as a whole society as well as individuals would be able to engage in a way that is the best for them. And connected to that is, you shall not make for yourself any idols. You see, any idol limits God. That physical representation would be a limit to the reality of the God that we met in Exodus 3, where he called himself the I Am. The I Am is a fascinating definition or name for God, because I am is an incomplete statement. I could say, I am, and you'd be waiting for me to finish that phrase. I could say, I am a father, or I am a teacher. And as soon as I finish that phrase, then that brings a little bit of a limitation, because I'm actually more than those things. And the marvelous thing is that when Moses said to God there in Exodus 3, who shall I say sent me? Now, what is your name? The answer is, I am. I am who I am. And that is a marvelous definition. But as soon as you create an idol, whether it's a bull or whether it's a human figure or whether it's an image of the sun, you immediately limit God, because that does not represent God. And so creating an image, creating an idol, was an affront to the greatness of God and the bigness of who he is. Now, we are New Covenant believers, and we can whiz down in time, and we come to what the Apostle Paul says in Colossians. When he is speaking about Jesus, he says Jesus is the very image of God. And so we see that eventually there was an image of God. Jesus said in John's Gospel, he who has seen me has seen the Father. But we see that the image that God created for himself was a living, breathing person who in his love and character and very being reflected the heart of the Father. And so you can see, when you compare an idol of a cow or a goat or even a human being, then how limiting that is, to have a statue that can't hear or breathe or move or do anything. That is such an affront to the living God. And so he said to them, you shall not make for yourself any idols. And these first two lay a foundation of the kind of worldview that he wanted Israel to have, because as I said, who we worship will affect the way the society works itself out. The next one, you shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God. Now, often we read that and we think we should not blaspheme. It's talking about blasphemy, and of course it is. It is wrong to blaspheme, because that is demeaning to the holy God that we love and serve. But there's another dimension to this, and that is often in a society that wasn't so literate, or at least if they were literate, they wouldn't have pens and papers and computers and all the things we have today. So a lot of the society was based on verbal agreement. It was on the oral traditions, and other things. And so when two people came together to make a contract, then it wouldn't be written down, it would be spoken. And so if we say, for example, two business people wanted to come and make an agreement to conduct some business, they would agree the terms of business, and then they would vow to one another in the name of God that they would keep their agreement. And so the name of God was brought into play to confirm that. Now, if one of those people failed to live up to their promise, then what they were doing is they were taking the name of God in vain. They were making the wrongful use of the name of God. And so, as he's talking about the kind of society he wanted Israel to be, what we see is he wanted people who would use the name of God with honor. When we come to the New Testament, in Matthew, I think it's Matthew 6, a Sermon on the Mount, Jesus speaks out against those who would swear, and they would use a name wrongly, because it seems that it had become quite a custom. The Pharisees had ways of making a vow, but making it in such a way they didn't have to keep it. And Jesus condemns them for that. And so we have a challenge here, or a command here, that the name of God should not be taken in vain or wrongly used. We then have the Sabbath day. And the Sabbath day is a remarkable entity because what it requires is 6 days work and then 1 day rest. And I want you to notice that the day of rest was not just for the people, but also for any slaves that they may have working for them, but even for their working animals, and even for any resident alien, any foreigners who are living among them. And what he's saying here, and this is a gift, that you work 6 days, but then 1 in 7 is a day of rest. And we need to remind ourselves that this didn't mean that they all went to the temple or the tabernacle or like for us to church. It wasn't a day where they would be involved in that kind of activity. It was actually a time for them to rest. And they had to rest so they could be refreshed. And so there was this rhythm. Now, this is unique to the Jewish people. People in pagan societies, they didn't have the rhythm of the 1 day in 7. I like to ask some of the students I teach if they are so grateful we have a weekend. And of course everybody loves the weekend. Well, we need to remember the reason we have a weekend is because of this particular scripture, that there's a rhythm of 7 and you take a day of rest in that 7. In pagan societies, the rhythm was around the agricultural cycle and the various pagan festivals that would have been put into play. And so we have remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Honor your father and your mother. Again, this is to say that the younger people should have respect. And this brings about strong families. The fact that there's a recognition of parents and children. And this command is so that their days may be long and it may go well with them and in the land. In other words, as parents are honored and elderly people are honored, so society can be strong and they would be obeying the covenant and live long in the land. You shall not murder. You shall not murder speaks about the value of human life. Human life in Israel should be valued. Now, we will go on, and you've already, of course, seen this in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. This is talking about selfishly taking life. They did have the death penalty. That was one of the consequences of crimes. They also had an army that was to protect them as a people. But here we're talking about murder. And the reason this is important is because in God's constitution, human life had value, and it shouldn't be taken lightly. Neither shall you commit adultery. Here, the desire is that the sexual energy of all of the people of the nation should be channeled into a marriage, and a marriage that there's a covenant between a man and a woman, and they come together. And strong families do create a strong and wholesome society, and I think we have seen that over and over again. And both of these things are actually also addressing the challenge of idolatry, because in the Canaanite societies, the sacrifice of humans was part of their different ceremonies. We read this through, you've read about this in Leviticus, you come into Judges, you come into Kings, and the prophets, you see this over and over again. Human sacrifice was part of the pagan worship system, as was sexual activity in the fertility rites. That is, people going into religious prostitutes as part of the worship. And so in these societies, murder and adultery were kind of built into the society. And what God is saying here is that in my nation, in the society that I want to see, there is a value for human life. We do not murder, and also marriages should be strong, and adultery should be something that is not part of you. Neither shall you steal. Now this is fascinating, because this affirms private ownership. Israel was not some kind of commune or community. Each person had their own land and their own possessions. I can't steal something that you don't own. If you own it, then it's possible for me to steal it. And so here we see God saying, respect people's private ownership of property. You shall not steal it. And you know that there's consequences if someone is shown to be a thief. And neither shall you bear false witness against your neighbour. Now this is talking about telling the truth, but more than that, it's again addressing the law court system. That when someone is come into the court situation and they have to give a testimony, that they give an honest testimony, that they don't lie under oath, as it were, but rather there is truth. And even as there's truth in the law court situation, of course, it should be the same in the whole of society. Now, all of these commandments are, if you like, external. It's how we act or how we speak or what we do. But God is not only interested in our actions, He's also interested in the heart. And that's why the last one, you shall not covet your neighbour's wife or house or field or slaves or donkey or anything that belongs to your neighbour. Because God doesn't just want a people who are righteous outwardly, but He would want that to be an inward thing. Because as you take care of the inward, so you take care of the outward. And so you see that the Ten Commandments are not just a group of burdensome laws to try and make life difficult for Israel, but rather they become a foundation of a nation that can flourish in freedom as they embrace these and live them out. And we do see, as the Old Testament unfolds, there were times when this was the case, when the law was observed. It was a time of great flourishing and blessing in the land. Now, having restated those 10 commandments, we then find that for the rest of this general stipulations portion, that there's a threefold theme. And that threefold theme is the importance of obedience. Of course, that's the foundation. And out of that obedience we become blessing. And connected to that is the fruitfulness of the land. And so it's like a triangle. You have the obedience, but as that happens, there's blessing and the land flourishes. And this is something that it took me a long time to notice this, but in this passage, the word land is repeated a number of times, because the way Israel lived would be reflected in the land that they are part of. If they are obedient, there will be rain, and there would be protection from disease, and there would be fertility, and all these things would flourish, and the land would be protected from invading armies. But if they disobey, then those things are different. There'd be drought, there'd be invading armies, there would be pestilence, and things would be very different. And so what we see is this emphasis of covenant faithfulness. God committing to his side of the covenant and calling Israel to obedience with their side of the covenant. And so, having restated the 10 Commandments, we then come to chapter 6, where there's this part that becomes so important to ancient Israel and even to many in modern Israel, and that is what is known as the Shema. And that is the statement, the creedal statement of in chapter 6 verse 4. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your might. And keep these words that I'm commanding you today in your heart. And so you see this exhortation there, a call to loving God, to be involved in covenant faithfulness. But the second thing is the importance of education and teaching their children. That they should recite these commandments to their children when they're at home and when they're away. And in verse 20, when your children ask you in the time to come, what are the meanings of these laws and statutes? You shouldn't say to them, shut up and be quiet, I'm too busy. But rather, you should explain to them. And then there's a whole teaching there that should be explained. In other words, the value of children, the value of education, and the importance of the covenant and the stories and the understanding being passed down the generations. Because if the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren understand the ways of God, then the obedience of the people will come down the generation, and so along with that will be the blessing. When you come to chapter 7, there's really a focus on them actually possessing the land. And even as they were dismayed by the Canaanites before, now they should not be dismayed by them. And a warning that they should not intermarry with them. Because if they intermarry with them, then what is going to happen is the challenge of faithfulness to the one true God will be attacked. They'd end up in syncretism. Syncretism is where you worship, where they would worship Yahweh, but also worship the Canaanite deities. And And there's clear instructions about how they should deal with these situations. You should break down the altars and smash their idols and cut down their sacred pillars. And these are the elements of Canaanite worship, the paraphernalia of Canaanite worship. They should be destroying these worship places around the land. And they shouldn't be proud. Even though God is going to give them this land, it's not because they're a great people, but rather it's because of God's faithfulness to Abraham. That's why they're getting it. And so a continual exhortation to faithfulness and obedience, and then again a challenge that when they see the nations, they're more numerous, they should not be afraid of them. And rather, God is going to give them the land. And it will be little by little, battle after a battle, defeat of the enemy, and so the land will be possessed. And so there's this marvelous exhortation in chapter 7 for them to, this time, prove God, but to beware of the idolatry. And chapter 8 is interesting because he's reminding them of the challenges they faced in the wilderness, and to remember how for 40 years they wandered in the wilderness, and during that time God provided for them. He fed them when they were hungry. He clothed them when they needed clothing. Their shoes didn't wear out. All of these things, God was very faithful. And verse 5, then know as in your hearts, as a parent disciplines a child, so the Lord your God disciplined you. And so it was a time of discipline, but it was a time of proving God. And but they were in the wilderness, and it was supernatural provision. Now they were going to move into a new situation. It was no longer a wilderness situation. They were going to move into a land that was a good land, flowing with water and springs and valleys. There's a land of wheat and barley, fig trees, and all of this produce. It even had iron and copper. In other words, it was a land that was a beautiful land they could prosper on. And the problem, of course, is when you prosper, or when they prosper, they were tempted to forget God. Verse 11, take care that you do not forget the Lord your God. Verse 14, then do not exalt yourselves, forgetting the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt and the house of slavery. Verse 17, do not say to yourself, by my power and the might of my own hand has gotten me this wealth. But remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you power to get wealth. And so you can see here, again, it's a call to faithfulness. The wilderness, they needed to depend on God. Without His supernatural provision, they had nothing. But now they were going into a situation where they could easily find themselves forgetting God, because they no longer needed Him like they did before. And He says to them, when you prosper, when you're blessed, do not forget me. And this, of course, is a challenge for all of us. If there's a dependency for the supernatural, we have to see it in provision or some other way. We are pressing into God and calling upon God. But then when everything's going fine, we have everything we need. We have to remember that is because of God's faithfulness. It's not because of what we have done, but it's because of what He has done, and to continue to be people who are pressing into Him. Chapter 9 and 10, I trust you noticed, is really one complete unit, because what he's doing, he's reminding them of the lessons that they learned from the golden calf incident. This, you remember in Exodus 32 to 34, a terrible moment in Israel's history, because Moses was up the mountain. They thought Moses had died, and so they asked Aaron to create a god for them, and it produced the golden calf. And when that happened, Moses came down. He broke the tablets of clay, which the Ten Commandments were on, and then there was a destruction of the calf, and the judgment and the call to repentance. And then Moses went up the mountain with fresh tablets of stone that were being carved out of the rock, and God wrote the Ten Commandments on them. The reason they were stone is because, of course, that what they used. I've shown you in a previous teaching examples of the suzerainty covenant that had been carved on stone, and stone was often used for this kind of particular thing. So we shouldn't be surprised that Moses would have tablets of stone, and so God wrote the Ten Commandments on the second pair of tablets, and the covenant there was renewed. And so he reminds them of the thing that happened, and a call to guard against that kind of thing, and how what God requires of them is that they should fear the Lord their God, verse 12, chapter 10, and walk in his ways and love him and serve him. Serve the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul. Keep his commandments. And how God, even though, verse 14, the heaven and the heaven of heavens belong to the Lord your God, that God has set his heart in love on you and even as he chose the ancestors, he has chosen you, their descendants, so they should circumcise then the foreskin of their hearts. In other words, that covenant shouldn't be just an external thing, but it should become an internal thing. And you can see here, can't you, just Moses preaching his heart out to them, that they would be faithful to in their relationship to God. And then verse 11, or chapter 11, is a final exhortation. It's almost as if it's more of the same, because Moses is just preaching his heart out that they would be faithful. Verse 11, chapter 11, verse 1, you shall love the Lord your God, therefore, and keep his charge and his decrees, his ordinances, his commandments. Remember today that it's not your children, but you who must acknowledge his greatness, his mighty hand and his outstretched arm and all the signs that he did. In other words, you today need to acknowledge the greatness of this God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, through the wilderness, brought you to this place, given you his covenant, set his heart in love upon you, and be faithful to him. He stresses the fact that when you go into the promised land and when you're settled there, the temptation is going to be to turn to the gods, the Canaanite gods. Because in the mythology of the Canaanites, it was Baal who gave the rain they needed for crops to grow. And it was the Asherah that gave fertility to the animals and the women in the land to have offspring. And the temptation would be that the Canaanites would embrace these deities. And what we have here in verse 13, Moses saying, it is God who will give you rain. It was God who will provide these things. You need to be faithful to him. And in that faithfulness to him, if you love him with all of your heart and soul, so these things will be provided and you will know his prospering.